it's a new wave. Flexing, my section. Couple of the brodies in the baddies, Now she be digging my flow. Standing on all of my toes. Riding out there for my bros. Let's get it. Always that 100. Never go back on the code. Never. Waiting my time till I blow. You know it's coming for sure. You know it. Do this for all of my bros. I do it. Flexing for real, don't care how they feel. To let anyone know. I do it. Man, cop me a deal and pop me a seal from the top all the way from the floor. Know I be doing the most. I did. Flexing on purpose for sure. Yeah. When I step on the scene, it's a show. Cause first you know I ball, money, then I flex. Know that I'm flex. Hit my G, know that I get it. Rep my set. Gang, gang, gang. Can I flex? Can I flex I ball, then I flex. Know that I'm flex. Hit my G, know that I get it. Rep my set. Gang, gang, gang. Can I flex? Let's get it. You know how I.
Yes. Hello and welcome to I Am Perspective Radio Show. I'm your host, Joe Rel Whitfield, and I'm with my host,
Nasi Alam.
I am the host, and with my host.
And we are the co-founders of I Am Perspective Radio. And we are here today with episode 3, Desi Women for the People. And we have some special guests with us today.
I want to hear like cheers when you say that. Like you can't say just like Desi Women for the People. You should be like, ah!
Right.
Just be in the background with it.
Do it, yes. So before we actually go into introductions, I do want to actually bring up what Desi is, because I think a lot of people, even as we posted this topic, did not know what Desi meant. They were like, okay, what is that? So, Desi is people who originate from the South Asian continent. It's specifically countries of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And there are a few other countries that may be a part of that, but those are the major countries. So that's clarifying that for anyone who really just wanted to know what that word was before we got into anything else.
Don't feel bad about yourself. I didn't know. and Nuzzy was my friend for 20 years, so don't feel bad.
That's a very real thing. So, we're going to turn it over to our special guest, and we're going to tell us your name, right? We want you to be able to pronounce it properly. So even before the show started, we were actually just sitting here kind of practicing it a little bit. And I know how I am with people pronouncing my name properly. So I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves properly. Tell us a little bit about yourselves as well. And any one of you can start. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarika Kumar. You can ask me multiple times. I always invite people to ask me, oh, how do you say your name, rather than like be like, oh, how do you say it? So, Sarika. I was born in Queens very early on, moved out to Long Island. I guess I'll speak a little about that later on, hopefully. But a lot of that has informed, I guess, who I am today. My background is Punjabi Sikh. I work primarily in gender and racial justice organizing, starting off with a lot of youth organizing, working with young people across the city, trying to change their neighborhoods and what they see for themselves and their visions. And right now I'm doing a lot of reproductive justice organizing.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you. It's good to meet you. My name is Kajal Shah. I'm the same way with my name. From very young, I was like, I don't have a nickname, but you can ask me 100 times to repeat it. I think names are important.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also a Queens girl, so we like an official Queens crew up here today. Yeah. So born and raised in Queens, first generation American born. Mm-hmm. My parents are from Gujarat, India. They came to the States over 40 years ago, like 45 years ago, and immigrated to Boston first, and then came to New York City before I was born, which I'm grateful for.
Right.
Difference me and my brother have. So, what else?
Now, I know Nussi gave the definition of Desi. Have you always identified as Desis or Desi American?
Yeah.
Or do you? Or
yeah. So I definitely identify as Indian, and then yes, a part of the Desis.
Right.
Because I was born and raised in New York, I had a little disconnect with India for a long time, but we grew up with a lot of traditions in our home, so I was always very clear that I'm Indian and that I was born here. From young, we would go visit India like every 5 years. So I got to see I have and had a lot of family in India. All my cousins were there growing up. So, but yeah, I'll pass it on to you around that.
I would say, and I don't know, it might be like generational too. I feel like I didn't use Desi that much. And I think regionally, so like Punjabis are like very hardcore. They're like, we're Punjabi. They're like, I think that ethnic and that regional tie is really strong. So I've primarily always like called myself Punjabi, which is a state in northern India.
Okay.
And Desi, I have seen it though used a lot to like bring together South Asians. And then, of course, there's always a critique of like, and I think, Nasi, as you mentioned, not every country amongst the South Asian diaspora is a part of the Desi term. So then people are like, well, I'm not Desi because I'm like from this country or I'm from this region. So always like, I think language also changes over time. So seeing like shifts where people are saying, I'm connected to South Asian histories, or trying to figure out like, how do you call this group of people from so many different places?
And Desi is a very, well, it's a term that was probably invented in the Western, whether it was in England or America, I'm not even sure, to be honest. But the reason it is, I don't really go around calling myself Desi either. I'm Bengali American. I consider myself Bengali. But in a broader sense of terms, that's the easiest way to really identify us, I think. That I've heard sometimes South Asian can be also misinterpreted to be meaning other countries that don't necessarily represent me or where I'm from. Before I Am Perspective, I actually was a blogger, and the blog that I created was ABCD Files. ABCD standing for American Born Confused Desi. And the reason, the purpose of that blog really was sharing my perspective as someone that was born and raised here and dealing with a cultural clash, right? So even in figuring out what terms that we classify ourselves as was a whole thing. I'm like, what is it? What do I classify myself as, right? So,
and that goes into identity and belonging. We have our next event at the end of the month at Civic Hall is about identity and belonging. And a lot of our conversations about perspective are like, well, how do you identify? You know, I just heard of 3-4 different versions, and I speak as a black man, and for myself on this show, but from what I know from our culture, this is what I knew within our culture. We do all this sub stuff, and you're black but not black, and you're grit, you know, and to understand that that's a identity thing. We're all like, what part of Desi do we belong to, or are we Indian, or you know, it's interesting to see that from my standpoint.
And we're only having this conversation because
worldwide thing.
A lot of people are looking at us and they don't see the difference, right? So even having this conversation of like that there are differences, even with 3 of us sitting in this room right now, a lot of people can walk into the room like, oh, there's a difference? I didn't know. And it's differences of the language that we speak, the religion that we follow, right? There are some shared like cultural, maybe some things that are similar. We like to wear red as brides, I guess. I don't know. Is that a thing? I don't know. Huh? Right? So, in terms of identity and belonging and why we have you guys here today, as Desi Americans, or however you specifically identify, what role do you think you have in America and in the justice system and the fight for rights? Let's get straight into it and why we're here today.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
It's the question.
Yeah, and I was actually still like thinking through the identity piece and how much of that has then like shaped who I am and the work that I do or am connected to, because I don't always feel like it's work that I do, but it's like part of me and my duty for being here and like understanding and knowing. So even when I think about identity, it's like, what are all the things that make me, right? Like being a first generation American-born person, being a New Yorker, being into hip-hop, really being connected my whole life to Black community, and lesser to the Desi, Indian, Gujarati community, that as I got older really was like, hey, I know this is a really big part of me as well, so let me understand it all. So for me, it was just like, how did I grow up? My parents are really compassionate, empathetic, open people that have always allowed my brother and I to like explore and be who we wanted to be and who we are, which then led me to like my own journeys of exploration and kind of like, what is this world that we live in, you know? And so I remember key moments growing up around language used when we were in spaces with other Indian folks primarily, and it was like, we don't use those words, right? Like Galia to refer to a Black person. It's like, no, we don't use that language in our home. And we don't, you know, and then all the way up to like, yeah, so for me, it's like, how was I raised, and then how do I view the world? And so I have definitely key moments in my journey where I'm like, oh, this is when I started to build my political analysis. This is when I started to really become aware of the systems that are in place that keep us all in this social construct of identity, right? And so then it was like, okay, if I understand this, then what's my role in then shifting that? And yeah, so I don't know. I'll stop there and then pass it on. Yeah, because I was like, did I answer the question about role? But I think I'm getting there.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks for giving me time to think. But I think similarly on upbringing, so I grew up primarily in Long Island. My family moved to predominantly upper middle class neighborhood, majority white. Now it's like probably 50% Asian. And I think growing up in Long Island and also having cousins who lived in Queens, seeing both like the racial differences, class differences, like woke me up at a really young age, and I also had my cousin telling me everything about myself at a very young age. But now I can say I'm grateful for them for kind of helping me be who I am. And so, you know, a very clear distinction that people often make in Long Island is that you have like one of my best friends who's an organizer says there are the Hempsteads and the Garden Cities. And Hempstead being primarily Black and brown, Garden City, street down, you just drive down the street and it's majority white. And then you look into public school, it's different, like funding's different, policing's different. And this is where like, these are the neighborhoods around me. And so being someone who grew up in a very like sheltered space within that, and especially being South Asian and how like Asian identity often is used as like a wedge between amongst like either like people of color, especially in like non-Black POC, the idea of the model minority of like, oh, like Asians are successful. I think a lot of that was coming to me. I just didn't have the words for it. So it was really like having access to school and like learning, being in community with other both Asians, Black folks, brown folks, like across the spectrum to learn like what is it. And I don't think until I got the words to describe it, otherwise you're just in it, you're witnessing it, but then you don't have the tools to like try to actively address it or challenge it. So I feel like that's where I'm at right now, and trying to guide more, especially like South Asians who might have similar or not similar backgrounds as me, to get to that point too. What moving beyond, I guess, like allyship into like what does solidarity and what does all the new words that they talk about, comradeship and all this. But like, what does it mean to like, you know, really be a disruptor rather than like complacent in the system? But
I think an important thing that came up for both of you, and it also comes up for me, is how we were raised, right? Even
and where,
being,
and where,
right? Because we could have had very significantly different experiences than other South Asian people, Desi people, right? I was also in a household where you couldn't say words like that against like Black people or about anyone really, right? My dad was an activist and a freedom fighter himself, so I grew up in that kind of household. So I'm like, I wouldn't understand anything. Like I remember when I was 13 years old, we had someone staying with us, and he was saying something. I honestly, I don't remember anymore what he said, right? But I remember I'd be like, no, you can't say that. You can't say that stuff in my house, right? And ended up, like, essentially, like, I'm 13, kicking him out the house. Like, I had the right to do that. But, like,
see, that's that double Aries.
Using it to fight for justice.
Yeah. But I remember this person was paying rent, or essentially they're supposed to be paying rent, right? And I remember thinking, like, oh my God, my dad's going to be so mad at me when he comes and he finds out what just happened. But he actually came home and he was just, like, just so quiet about it. Even though what I found out later on, he lost, like, $10,000. Like, this person never just paid because they were so, like, offended that, like, I had this conversation with them. But I was able to have that kind of conversation. And I don't think that's something that would have passed in any household, right? Because as we know, we obviously have people in our community that we need to have certain kind of conversations with so they can come from a different kind of understanding. Right?
I hear definitely one. I hear the New York of it all. You know, I didn't know that there were other cultures in other parts of the states. I really sound ignorant when I think about my youth growing up as a real New Yorker. I was like, well, they got black people here, they got Indian people here. So I know now that there were other, or there were Indian people, there were Bengalis in other states. But do you think it's also a New York specific thing? Because, you know, I hear Long Island, Queens, and we're talking about, like, Queens. There's no other place like Queens in the world where you have these many cultures that are all together, you know. I hear that unique experience. I wonder what that looks like. So that's why we're definitely interested in having powerful people like yourselves up here, because I don't know if everybody gets that feel. I think there's a justice tone. So, you know, I do have a question underneath this, but, like, I feel like there's a justice ring around in different cities and so forth, and not that New York is the only place that does justice, but this unique melting pot. So, well, like, what is justice to you? You know, I know that sounds like loaded, right? You know, but in the sense of why you started doing what you're doing, you know, like, what is that ring of justice? I'm mending it with what you got from your New York experience as well, like the uniqueness of how you grew up in Queens and then Long Island. Like, then what really drove you to, like, I'm banging for justice?
I can start. I feel like you just said so much. You said so much, and it's all really good. And I'm like, oh, how do I respond to it all? You know. So just starting from a New Yorker perspective. So for me, I think there's, like, I've always felt resistance in my spirit around what is unjust, right, and what is not right. And so I definitely think New York, and I'm so grateful to be a New Yorker for a lot of reasons. I'm also clear that it has skewed my perception of what the rest of the world looks like, especially this country, right? When I moved to DC for a while, it was like, oh, yeah, people are just really being nice in New York in some ways, right? And this is what it really looks like in the rest of the country when we talk about racism, classism, sexism, all the, like, homophobia, transphobia, all of the things, you know. And so what I know is that, like, I think for me, no matter where I am in the world or would have been in the world, there I would have been a freedom justice fighter. I feel like it's in my spirit. My ancestors, as I've gotten to, like, know more about my people, like, my specific lineage has always been in resistance while being in India under, like, British rule, right? Like, there's all the history behind that kind of stuff, and then how they've also showed up within conflict around Hindu-Muslim conflict, and who my people were in India at that time, making choices around where they were going to stand, right? And so I'm grateful for my New York experience, because it's like, yeah, I did really grow up with a lot of black folks, and I've been in community with folk. I love hip hop, right? That's definitely a New York thing, growing up in the 90s, right? I just turned 41, so it's like, yeah, that was the time that I was growing up in New York City, and I'm grateful for that experience. It's definitely shaped my analysis and the kind of work that I do. I have done a lot of anti-police violence work, even in my, you know, just like for a long time, because it's like I grew up in New York City in the 90s. I mean, not that it's it looks different now. But right, stop and frisk and all the things have been around for a long time. So I think for me, it's like always been in my spirit. And yeah.
Yeah.
New York
You
helped
say
shape that.
it doesn't matter where I be. You be fighting. I get that. I get that feel as well. You know, I know New York specifically shaped me, but anywhere I would have been, I felt like I would have been banging for something. You know, coconuts on the island. We ain't got no coconuts.
So
I'm biased because I've only lived in New York, so I can't speak of anywhere else. But I also think, like, coming from a Sikh background, so like Sikh is the faith that I like would mostly identify with. I think there's a long history of resistance there too. One that I was not really told, but I think there is something about like maybe it's ancestral, like passing of like this is what your people did. But I know even recently when I was able to go back to Punjab and learning of like an uncle who had like died because of the British, or like that there was a house of worship that was like attacked because of like interfaith conflicts. Like that history is living and is right there. So I'm like, oh, maybe it's not surprising that this is the path that I chose. But I think early on, it was actually like post 9/11, like I was very young. A lot of people would be like, oh, you're too young to remember. I was in second grade for context. But that was something.
I'm like, I was senior of high school.
I was like, that was my first year of grad school.
Yeah.
I was alive.
I feel like that, and depending on like how old you were, where you were, I feel like that's also something that really affected a lot of New Yorkers. And then being like Sikh, Punjabi, like, and in Long Island, like I don't think the communities I was in were not of target. Like I think Queens was more, especially like working class South Asian communities were definitely more targeted. But I still remember that fear, and I still remember like growing up very much like my grandfather wore a turban and being ashamed of him wearing a turban. And so I think for me, a long times I was like the media and like the government was telling me this is who is the enemy, and that enemy also looking very much like who my grandfather was, even though that's, you know, and a lot of these messages that were used again to put people against each other, where it was like, oh, like why did I look at my grandfather's turban and be like, oh, some people see this as a threat, when the things are much bigger, right? And so I think when I think of justice, maybe that's where it started from, of being like, why should a little kid be fearful? And I think fear looks so different based on so many identities in so many communities, but I think that's usually like, I don't know, the machine that's trying to like make people, right? Or suppress the masses, or what do you want to say? But I feel like a lot of it comes from like fear, and like how fear can also immobilize you and immobilize communities, and just seeing how people, even with fear, move. And so I think that's, I don't want to think of justice.
So I think a lot of people, are provoked by some sort of injustice, and that usually ignites them to action. So a lot of South Asian people or Muslim people or Sikh people who have been dealing with some sort of backlash, they could go and just fight for themselves, right? There's a lot of people who are just looking to do, you know, to get South Asian rights, or really just to get recognition for their own communities. What would make you fight for other people besides yourself?
I love it. Y'all have like a team.
I know, I feel like we're reading each other. Okay. Why fight for other people? I guess there's just no other way. I really think, like, people, like, we've been separated, or like people, especially when we think of, and organizing's hard, right? Like, I think there's so many organizers experience so many threats daily. If you're on the front lines, it's like a very, I think it's still a different reality than being someone who is able to amplify or support, particularly like directly impacted communities. And so I see like the position that I have, whether it's like I have like either privilege in whether it's like having a job with benefits or whatnot, to be able to use that, and what does it look like to work alongside with directly impacted communities. Never to like speak for or on behalf of, but that there needs to be like resource mobilizing, Like, people need to be funded. People are there, like, connecting folks. So I feel like there is a place for everyone in this either the social justice, like, diagram or what your role is. And in terms of just, I don't know, I feel like I've been able to be where I am today because of so many, like, Black and brown women. Like, that's who I give my credit to. And that's who I build with. And so I don't really see other ways of moving forward without everyone. And I think there's so many, like, feminists and you, like, read all the theories, but also, like, the Instagram posts. But people, right? But, like, what does solidarity mean? What does, like, your liberation being connected? I think Angela Davis often talks about that. So, and even just, like, when you're thinking, like, who are the role models, right? Is your role model, like, if you're only been shown, like, a certain type of role model, and then there's, like, a whole host of, like, whether it's, like, queer role models, Black women who are, like, activists, or like, Mexican artists, right? Like, who are your, or even South Asian role models? Like, that's always a question mark, because they're not that many, I often feel like. So that I've also looked towards other identities as role models, and it's just my way of, like, building and giving back. But I'm finding role models right now, so this is nice.
All right, where do I go? So,
no,
I love it. Like, you
you.
said
That
so
was
much,
perfect.
and I'm like, okay, how do I build off of that? What do I?
Wait, hold on, let me get it.
Yeah, exactly. I was like,
That's
ditto,
my cheer
like,
button.
kind of check marking, like, yes. So some of it for me was, like, rooted in personal experience, and it was, like, then started, like, connecting the dots. Like, I remember the first time that I had a police officer pull a gun to my head, you know, and it wasn't the last, right? And then I remember being in my first year of college and figuring out, like, where's, like, space that I belong in, and actually, very gratefully, you know, going to the Student Liberation Action Movement, which was SLAM, in the student government at the time, looking for a friend, and then, like, really started my political, like, work there and really organizing and understanding. So I was given a book by Kai Barrow, who I love, and is a Black woman that I consider a mentor. She handed me Asada's autobiography, and she was like, hey, read this and then come talk to me after it. And I literally, like, read it overnight, and then there started to be understanding of, like, oh, this happened to me, or I was with someone for 7 years that's Haitian American, and grew up in Bushwick, Brooklyn, right? So I was, like, the Queens girl and Brooklyn dude, and, like, he's a DJ, and he was having a love affair, and it was like, oh, right, what's happening to you in Brooklyn that my people are not experiencing, or that I'm not experiencing? Right. But then I started experiencing, right, personally, when, like, maybe, like, where I was or who I was with was shifting, even though I had seen some of it, right? And then I read Asada's book, and then it was like, okay, these systems, right? And then this is happening to me locally and personally, but this is actually not an individual experience. This is happening, like, all the time. And then, like, connecting with people from the Bay Area, and then hearing, oh, like, somebody got killed by the police there. And then it's like, oh, this is, like, right? And so for me, some of it was personal experience, and then a lot of my work was rooted in anti-police violence work from the beginning, which historically has been rooted in anti-Blackness. And so when I think about who am I fighting for or with, I'm fighting white supremacy all the time, and in all the ways that shows up in us, right? Like, how we are, what is like, actually, like, it's all around us. So how does it show up in our own ways of being? So when you talked about, like, feeling embarrassed, right? I've had those feelings too, of being Indian and having to explain to people, like, well, where is India? Do y'all have cars there, right? Like, there used to be embarrassment over that, and that shifted over time. Like, wait, I actually love this part of me. I actually love that this makes me who I am, that it makes me dynamic, right? That it allows me to have different perspectives and experiences. But for me, it's like a bigger fight. Like, I'm clear that globally anti-Blackness and white supremacy are, like, what's leading so many injustices and what we're facing. And so for me, it's like, where am I needed and wanted? Where do I have impact? Where am I impacted? yeah, and then where do I feel held, right? Where are the communities that actually hold me? And that's something newer for me, because it was like always a fight. And then a few years back, which folks knows, like, wait, hold up, like, I need to do this work out of love for my people and for Black people and for justice, versus in being in reaction to, because like this is gonna eat my soul up, and I still get to experience joy in this work. And so then it was like, okay, these are my like political views. This is how I move. This is the work that I feel most connected to. And where are the communities that hold me? Where are the communities that support me in building, like, further my political analysis or my understanding of like what's going on that I don't personally experience.
So speaking of communities that hold you and that you belong to, right? So this is also something, first of all, you saying that you get to find peace in the work. That's something that I definitely can agree with you on, right? Even in choosing to do this work, we've also had to do some personal work for ourselves and what that looks like. Because as you're doing work for other people, you also have to really take care of yourself, or it's just not going to work. In terms of belonging in communities, I think there's a misconception. There's a lot of South Asians and Desis that live in New York now, but my experience growing up, that was not the case, and maybe that was the same for you as well. And so I've always had to also, like, where do I belong? Where do my loyalties or whatever, where do I go, right? Like, what does that look like? And just a little quick story. So in the 4th grade, I was in a class, and I was the only non-Black girl. I was a Bengali girl, and we were doing a performance for I think it was for African History Month. It was some sort of performance, and everyone's getting dressed up, and we're all gonna dance. And my teacher, she was also Black, right? And she told me the day before, she's like, you can actually just wear your own outfit. You don't have to wear what everybody else is wearing. You can do the same dance. And I remember thinking, like, oh yeah. And I'm like, that makes sense, right? And like being able to do the same dance. And I would have worn the outfit, by the way. Like, I would have been like, yeah, sure, this is what we're all doing, right? But in that moment, her recognizing that I get to represent my own culture, right? That was able to give me something like, I could be a part of the community, but I recognize that I am different, right? And that I have a difference and a different understanding and a different perspective. With that being said, I do believe having that different perspective and that difference, it allows me some privileges that Black people may not have, right? So just kind of, one of the things that we like to do here at I Am Perspective is really just kind of recognize there are privileges in all communities, right? So, Jarrell has privileges, I have privileges, we all have privileges. So in the fight for the people, what does it look like to have the special privileges as we do as Desi Americans, where sometimes we're known as the model minorities, or, we might be more light-skinned, or whatever that is, we might be able to fit in certain places. So how has that shown up for you in doing this work?
I can take it. There's also, I wanted to build off of what you mentioned.
Yeah.
Because in thinking also of the privileges, like, white supremacy really functions to have an individualized society. So like people are not really caring for each other. It's like to each their own. And so the work you're doing, right? Like that, even as being communities, that's a resistance, right? That you're going to care for each other. That it's not about like turning your face when something is happening. So that building power in community, I just feel like is always resisting like white supremacy and like what we're being told. But yeah, the privileges. So I could go on about this. But I think so. Like for me, it's always been acknowledging and identifying my own privileges. I would say like being like light skinned and racially ambiguous often has like often made me not the target, even amongst like darker skinned South Asians. And then when you even then parallel that to what it looks like targeting surveillance of like Black and Latinx communities, like Where I stand is often either, what's the word, my proximity to whiteness, right? Like, has given me privileges that a lot of other members, yes. And so, again, that's like, what do I do with that then, right? It's like, I think some people might just be like, I think people get identity crisis from like, oh, well, I'm not brown enough, or I'm not this enough. But what I learned, it's not about saying that you're not enough, but it's like, okay, I understand that, and now how do I use that? And so that often has been, even in workspaces, trying to shift the power dynamic, right? When it's between, especially like a white colleague and maybe a black colleague, and knowing that I'm actually going to be listened to more, just based on how I look. And that sucks, but then it's also like where, not that where my alliance is, but like, now how do I make sure that one, that my other colleagues are like, the mic is being passed, that if she's not being heard, that I'm able to use my position to like say something or change that. So that's how I often see myself in a lot of spaces. Also for like, especially in the South Asian community, I feel like caste often doesn't come up a lot. So especially around where we're thinking of like casteism as like another layer to like how Hindu nationalism functions as like white supremacy here. But Hindu nationalism, especially across India. So that's another layer of work, because I think caste looks different sometimes, especially through migration here. Because being upper caste doesn't necessarily mean you are living a certain way of life that people do in their homelands, of having like access to resources and whatnot. But that caste also is like it's power. It comes with power. So that's some of the work that I've also been. What does it look like to support, especially Dalit women who are doing work to, especially anti-caste work, and especially a lot of the stuff happening in India right now with like the registry and certain bills that are like really pushing in the agenda that seem very parallel to like what the U.S. is also trying to do. So, but yeah, so much.
That's one of the things about perspective of these conversations. Is that once you start, it can really lead into so many different things to talk about. 100%. Right? An hour usually doesn't cut it.
Yeah. We'll have a part 2, and then you could bring other dope Desi women. You said so much, and it was like all dope. I was like, yes. What I connected to when you first started talking was about like resource shifting. So I also think about privilege and all the ways that show up. So I'm clear that I have a master's degree. That's a privilege, right? Academia. That we grew up not having a lot, but that we had a house, like an apartment, we had a car, right? There were certain understandings about that. Maybe it looked different amongst other family members, but I'm clear on how we grew up, like we always had. But then I also think about, so when I think about like, what's our role in that, in using our privilege? I think there's a range of ways, but it's like what you talked about, like where is my voice gonna matter, and forward someone and like support someone. Where am I actually taking stands? And then literally from like the smallest things, like, and maybe not small, right? But I just taught a class at Adelphi last semester. It was my first time teaching in academia, and it was like, all these like little privileges popped up, like unlimited access to New York Times articles or Canva, or you can watch these like free videos on this thing. And it was like small, like, hey, who needs a password, right? To my people. Like one of my friends is in college, she's an adult student right now, and she's like, every month I only get 3. I'm like, not anymore. Right? So it's literally from like small to then big, where when I was like in the right place, right time, right conversation. And at 23, while I was in grad school, got put in a position to be a program officer of a foundation. And it was a newer place, and the executive director really trusted me and was like, hey, you're doing this organizing work. We need to grant youth-based organizing groups. Like, do you know folks? It was like, I hit the ground running, like, yes, I do know folks, right? And then it was like a real commitment to like making sure that organizations that are really like, at that time, putting Black youth at the forefront in New York City, right? Who are like really the groups that are doing the work on the ground, get the resources. So for me, it's always like, in what position am I in? What privileges do I have? And acknowledge and actually understand how to use, right? Because I think some of that is unfolding as I as I live my life. It's like, oh, this U.S. passport, right, in a lot of ways is a privilege. I didn't understand that until my very like early 30s, right? In a way that was like, oh, I didn't realize that in this way, right? Those kinds of privileges, as they unfold for me, I'm like, okay, now what is in my capacity, and what is like, what can I do to shift that or use that to better, right? Or you know, that kind of thing. So
well, I want to take this because we are winding down in our episode, right? And we just spoke on privileges. No.
I know we said we were gonna take a break, but I don't think we needed it.
you know,
it's like, oh, all right, now we gotta close this. I wanted to take that and so we were speaking on perspectives. Oh, actually, what I was hearing from the three of you are perspectives, right? That you grew up in certain neighborhoods, you grew up around, in certain households within your own cultures, right? Because now you talk about the rest of the culture that you know. As Nussie and I talk, she speaks very highly of her family being unique in the sense that they were very tolerant, you know? So then, as I'm hearing that, and I really applaud you all for doing the work. You know, I think you would, like you said, you'd be doing it for your folks or for whoever, but to do it for justice, which inevitably means other people, and black and brown folks specifically, I think that needs to be commended. My question to either anybody is, how do you get other people who look like you in your culture to be as inspired? Like, what makes you different from the rest of the people?
I'll actually go first.
Yeah.
Right? So, you know, we've been doing I Am Perspective now for a little over 2 years. And this is the first time we had a Desi perspective of any kind. And a lot of that has been because getting Desi people in the room has been difficult. So, right, to have that kind of conversation, you gotta have the right people in the room representing. And so without that, it's kind of difficult to do that, right? So, it's a progress, right? I think for us, we might just have to go into certain communities. We might have to go to Queens. We might have to find them where they are. They're probably not gonna want to come out to the city. But I do see it shifting, right? I think there's sometimes certain conversations that, what I personally believe, what we believe here at I Am Perspective, is that when you shift the tone away from an argumentative debate, right, when you're actually really just looking to just share without like pushing your agenda on someone, it shifts something in people, and people are more willing to listen to you and be more open to it. I believe that now that we're doing these radio shows and people have more access to listening to what we're doing, then they also realize that this can be a conversation. We don't always have to agree, right? Like, maybe, you know, we may agree more than not tonight, but sometimes we might not, right? And we don't, you know, that's fine too, right? Like, even as Desi women doing justice work, we might have different opinions and perspectives around different things, so that's why. Yeah.
Oh yeah, go for it.
I can go quick. I think for me, it's like, so on a personal level, I think there's a lot of still learning that I'm doing for myself around how South Asian folks, Gujaratis, Indian folks, right, how national Hinduism, right, I don't identify as Hindu, but my mom does, and a lot of our family does, and so, right, there's a lot of learning and understanding for myself that's happening continuously, which then allows me to connect to, like, on a real micro level, my family, right? So my brother's married to a black woman. My nephews are black, young black men, Blindians, black and Indians, right? and so it's like, right, all the way in the micro level of like my mom, who's super open, but constantly having conversations with her, right, around like, oh, so your friend is trans, or the term they. It's like, hey, I'm going to introduce you to someone, they identify as they. It's like, well, can you explain that to me? So I love my mom for that. I'm always grateful because that's how she is. That's what has made me me, right? And then also then it's like I was just in the Bay last weekend, and my cousin, who I love, is pregnant. And then it was like just having small conversations, right? Like you said, those kinds of things. So for me on the micro level, it's a lot like, hey, what do you do? Like some of my family's like, what do you do? And then I'm like, oh, this is the work that I do. This is what it's rooted in. And I go back a lot to history and facts because it's like, you can't argue this.
Yeah, when you tell
like
people
you can't,
things,
right? Like you can't argue the number of like Black people killed by the police, right? With no justice behind that, right? No accountability, right? There's certain things that you can't argue, and so for me, that's been a place of like, because I get very emotional, and I'm like, but you know, and then I'm like, oh wait, I've really learned. My mother used to be like, you're angry a lot, and it was like, oh wait, but like, I don't want to be, right? And like, that's what the world wants me to be, because then, like you said earlier, like then it stops you from like being the difference and the change. It's like fear, like anger can really like be like. Can lead to hopelessness, right? Yeah. So for me, it's been like, wait, how do I shift this and then understand it? But then how do I also just like root it in like, no, this is what's happening, you know? And then I'm still like, you know, connecting over the last 5-7 years. I would say that I've been really growing my like South Asian, Desi women community particularly, and I'm really grateful for that in a lot of ways. And so then it's like, where do I fit in? You know, like. So,
I connect to especially like working with family too. Just, you know, either it's like changing language use. I feel like especially around like gender identity, that's been a big conversation that like my mom, my brother, my cousins, everyone's been like very supportive in like being open to the conversation, and a lot of it. Honestly has been like me posting things on Facebook, and I'm friends with my whole family on Facebook, which is like maybe good or bad, but I think it's worked because they'll see something. I had one auntie, she was like, you post so much about gender, like is everything okay? And it was really, and my mom was there, and my mom was there, and she was like, oh, but that's the work she does. And so to have her like affirm that like, oh, but you know, this is like the work I do, even if it's like, people say posting on Facebook, like, you know, that's just one thing, but, like, that's a lot where people get information, they get misinformation. So, trying to, like, I try to flood the stream on Facebook, and then having conversations, it's hard with family. I'm also the youngest of my whole generation, so that's always interesting, because people
so one step at a time, right? I think, even one of our, you know, so it's one conversation at a time, right? Because we don't think we have the answer, the solution to fix everybody and everything, but we do think we can shift, you know.
What's one conversation if your family's never had a conversation? You know, a lot of people ask us, like, yo, you know, what's after the talk? I was like, what happens with the talk? What happens when we have the talk more than once? You know, let's just keep it here for a moment. I know we have the whole world to change, but like we need to have one conversation, one step.
With that being said, we are closing down. So this is really an opportunity. Thank you guys really for joining us today and sharing openly. They're really, you know,
this was awesome.
You guys really went for it. You guys were able to really go there. So thank you. Let us know, you know, let the audience members know what you are currently working on, what support looks like for you, right? If you guys have any upcoming events or anything. This is really your opportunity to let us know. So I know you guys are doing work for the people. What can the people do for you?
Oh, that's sweet.
What can the people do for me?
I'll go. So actually, so I've been independent consulting for the last 10 years, doing like organizational development and strategy work within movements and like nonprofit spaces. I'm thinking about shifting that, like, and really building with more community. The independent life has been great, but sometimes it's a little isolating. And I'm just throwing things out there, no kind of like real request for support, but if someone hears it and it's like, oh, this might be a good fit for you, send it. I'm also continuing some of building on some of the teaching that I did. So I just taught a class called The Sociology of Global Social Problems, and I really loved it. And we'll be teaching it next semester again.
How can they contact you?
Yeah. So, my email is mskshah@gmail.com. So Miss K Shah.
Okay. And IG?
I'm the same on IG. MSK Shah on IG. So yeah, just to wrap that up, like I'm really looking at building curriculum and more training. So I co-founded an organization called Train the Movement while living in DC, and that's something that I really want to build on, that work, political education, and yeah.
Cool. I'll be contacting you.
Yeah.
But one thing, so I'm part of a giving project right now, and it's with the Northstar Fund that funds directly impacted communities who are organizing on the ground in New York State. And so my goal is 4,000. So if you can help me there, I do have a fundraising link that's up, or I guess you could contact me at kumar.sarika, SARIKA, the number 4, @gmail.com. And I'm happy to talk more about that and how you can get involved too.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you so much for being on episode number 3. It was
Thanks
wonderful talking with you and getting your perspective. Thank you all for listening and tuning in. For everybody, yes, this is live stream. I don't know if we told you that.
And you can follow I Am Perspective.
Oh, it's over there.
Yeah,
on our website, www.iamperspective.com, and also our Instagram, which is @i.amperspective. And coming up next, we have Speak Into Existence with May I Speak.
Thank you all.
Thank
See
you.
you next week. Peace.